of Genesis. We're going to read chapter 31 this morning. Genesis chapter 31, beginning of verse 1. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and has given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see, all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had, and arose and crossed the Euphrates, and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. When it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him, and pursued him for 7 days, and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night, and said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done, that you have tricked me, and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours, and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all around the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and female goats have not miscarried. and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts, I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was, by day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore he named it Galeed. And Mitzpah, for he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country, and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. This is the reading of God's holy and infallible word. When Jacob left his home in Canaan to go stay a little while with his uncle Laban, I imagine he surely could not have anticipated what his stay was going to look like. So he went there to stay a little while. His mother's words to him at that time were literally stay for a few days until your brother's anger subsides. He ended up being there for 20 years. He went there in part, anyway, to find a wife for himself from among the family of Laban, and he ended up with 2 wives and 2 concubines, or in essence 4 wives, when he went to find one. And we see from this text that his stay there, his 20 years, were a pretty hard 20 years. It was a difficult time. Reminded that Jacob the deceiver met his match in his uncle Laban, who tricked him into marrying his older daughter and then serving an extra 7 years for the hand of Rachel, which is what he agreed to in the first place. So essentially extorted 14 years of labor out of him. He then served another 6 years in which, as it appears from the text here, Laban tried to take advantage of Jacob at every turn, that Laban was constantly trying to gain the upper hand in this kind of a struggle ongoing between Jacob and Laban. And I think this reminds me of the kind of situation that, you would look back and go, man, if I had only known it was going to turn out like this, I would have never left. And yet, in spite of all the hardships, in spite of the injustices that Jacob suffered, the Lord was at work. And we pointed out a couple weeks ago that the Lord was working and would work in Jacob's life, that Jacob would not be left as he was, so to speak, but that God would work change in him. And one of the things that we see happening in this process, even through the 20 years that were difficult for Jacob, is that God did make him fruitful. He had 11 sons, and would have the 12th son yet on his journey back to Canaan. God prospered Jacob in his labor so that he became more and more wealthy. In fact, to be more precise, basically more and more of Laban's wealth began to be transferred to Jacob in all this process. And now at this point, it is time for Jacob to return home to the land that God has promised to him and to his descendants by covenant So at just the right time, the Lord prompts and stirs Jacob to leave Padan Aram and return to Canaan. And in all of this, I think there's a very clear picture for us of how the Lord is with his people in all times, in all places, in all circumstances, and even through the darkest times, through hardships and crises, the Lord promises to be with us. In the first part of our text here, we see how the Lord stirs up Jacob and sends him home. So the first 3 verses describe the circumstances that led Jacob to set out for the land of Canaan. He heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's. From what was our father's, he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. So a couple of different things begin to happen here, and we can see these things from 2 perspectives. From a very practical, earthly, and human standpoint, Jacob is increasingly falling out of favor with the family. Laban's sons are becoming jealous and resentful because Jacob has been profiting from their father's wealth, and Laban himself is changing his attitude. You know, he was really happy to have Jacob around and didn't want him to go home earlier because he could see that he was being blessed because of Jacob, that he was profiting. But now the tables have turned somewhat. The Lord's blessing is directly on Jacob. It's not profiting Laban anymore, and Laban's not so happy anymore. And remember that Laban is clearly, every time that we hear about him, is a rather dishonest, greedy, materialistic kind of character. And now that he's not profiting anymore, he's not so happy. Jacob's experience here, by the way, kind of mirrors the experience of his father when he was in the land of Gerar, because remember that the Philistines envied Isaac because of his prosperity, because in both cases the envy and the jealousy is attached to the blessing of God on his chosen people. And the Philistines began to plug up Isaac's wells because they were jealous of the blessing, the prosperity that God had given him. And it reminds us that we should know it's nothing out of the ordinary for the people of God to experience jealousy and hostility from those who belong to the world and who do not have a heart attuned to the work of God or the glory of God in the world. That began in some of the earliest history when Cain was angry with his brother and ultimately killed him. And John tells us, what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. And then he adds this note, do not be surprised, brother, if the world hates you. Well, Jacob now is becoming increasingly uncomfortable in Laban's household, so there's just the real practical side of this conflict and animosity, and the implication is Jacob is now kind of inclined to leave, to get out of Dodge, because the tables of the attitude is kind of turned against him. You can look at this also from the heavenly standpoint. In verse 3, the Lord spoke to Jacob and said, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. But these are really just 2 aspects of the same thing. In other words, in all of this, it is the Lord who is moving Jacob on. The Lord is sovereign as always. He's in control of all of these circumstances. And the fact that Jacob is no longer really in Laban's favor, he's being mistreated by Laban, he's having a hard time there, this is not because the Lord is completely absent now, as if the Lord was not with Jacob and sovereignly directing all of these circumstances. You might say that Jacob is having a hard time really because the Lord is present with him. And, in the Lord's sovereign providence, Jacob is not going to become too comfortable. And I think there's a couple of things that God is doing in this. One is that Jacob is learning to trust the Lord more. More and more, it becomes clear to Jacob that his prosperity and the blessing that he experiences is clearly from the Lord. The Lord is the real source of his blessing. And on the other hand, I think that the Lord is going to make Jacob uncomfortable in the land of Mesopotamia because he wants to move him out. It's time to head back to the promised land. And you think about it, things could have gone quite differently for Jacob. They could have gone along just swimmingly, so that Jacob was prospering and he's getting along with everyone well and everything is quite comfortable. He might have been treated nicely all the time, but then how much more difficult would it have been for Jacob to pack up all his possessions, take his wives and their children, venture out on this journey to go back to the land of Canaan? Would it not have been rather easy for Jacob to just stay where he was? And beyond that, would it not have been easier for Jacob to think that it was his own cleverness or his own hard work, or that it was the favor of his uncle Laban that brought him blessing and prosperity? And I say that because we should recognize that the Lord sometimes will use trials and hardships and injustices in our lives in a similar way, to teach us to trust Him more fully, to help us to lean more on His sufficiency and His strength for our needs, and recognize all our blessedness and all of our prosperity and our ultimate hope is in the Lord and in the Lord alone. And more than that, sometimes the trials that we have in life can have a way of creating within us a holy dissatisfaction or a holy discontent. A discontent with this present world, with all of what the world offers to us in terms of peace and comfort and prosperity and fulfillment, and helps to teach us to look out of this world and to look to Jesus Christ for our eternal and real satisfaction and for our joy, and to begin to long for our heavenly home. The trials are sometimes the things that help us to do what Paul admonishes us to do in Colossians 3 when he says to seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things that are above and not on the things that are on the earth. So the word of the Lord comes to Jacob. And remember that God spoke to Jacob back in chapter 28 when he set out from Canaan to go to Padan-aram. Now 20 years later, as it's time to head out from Haran and head back home, the word of the Lord comes to him again. And Jacob's response, as the Lord has spoken to him, the Lord basically affirming to him that it is time for him to head out to his homeland and go back to his family. Jacob's immediate response was to call his two wives and relate his plans to them. And we have to keep in mind here that these Leah and Rachel are going to be asked to leave their father's house, to leave their family home, and Jacob feels he needs their agreement in all of this. And as he explains this now to his two wives, we start to get a little bit more of the picture of how Jacob was treated by Laban. So remember that this arrangement was arrived at, whereby Jacob was willing to serve Laban, where his only wages would be the odd-colored sheep and goats from the flock. But Laban, as it turns out, over the last 6 years, kept changing the agreement. Laban, who again is constantly determined to get ahead, to figure out some way that he can profit off of Jacob and make things work to his advantage. So Jacob is saying that your father has cheated me, changed my wages 10 times, and yet God did not permit him to harm me. In other words, it's important to realize here that Jacob realized it was God who was with him. God is the source of blessing. In verse 5, the God of my father has been with me. In verse 8 and in verse 9, God has taken away the livestock of your father and has given them to me. In verse 7, but God did not permit him to harm me. More and more, I think you see that Jacob recognizes the hand of God in the blessing that he experiences. That it comes from the Lord. And then as he relates this dream, in which the Lord appears to him, in this dream he sees the flocks mating, and how the males that are mating are all striped and spotted and mottled. These are the odd-colored animals that he had agreed to work for his pay. And basically the point to the dream is simply to make it clear that the real reason Jacob prospered, and remember this whole narrative last week about how Jacob peeled stripes and sticks, put the sticks in the watering troughs, and so the animals are going to see the stripes, and that'll make them bring forth striped and spotted and mottled. And God's saying, no, it's because I'm blessing you. In other words, the real reason Jacob's prospering is not his skill, it's not his hard work, it's not his breeding methods, it's God's presence, it's God's blessing with him. And then in verse 13, there's a reminder of the previous vision in Bethel, when the Lord says, I am the God of Bethel. This is when the Lord appeared to him in chapter 28, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. And remember, Jacob's vow is that God will be with me and will prosper me and keep me in the way that I go and will bring me safely again to this land. Then I will give a tenth of everything to God, and he will be my God. God is now reminding Jacob of that vow. And Jacob begins to see, he can see God's faithfulness to what God has promised, that he would be with him, that he would prosper him, that he would bless him, that he would multiply him. So in other words, this is a time when Jacob can now look back over the last 20 years, and there's been a lot of hardship. And it's not been an easy time. And he kind of got cheated out of an agreement for the woman that he loved, and got sort of tricked into taking 2 wives, and there's conflict in his home, and he's been cheated out of, well, attempted to be cheated out of his wages many times over. And yet, Jacob should now look back over that 20 years and see that God has been with him. God never left him. God has been faithful. God has been working out his word and his promises in all of that. And that should be this great encouragement now for Jacob to go on in obedience into God's call. Rachel and Leah were more than willing to go along with Jacob's plan. They felt betrayed by their father as well when they say in verse 14, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners, for he has sold us and has indeed devoured our money? The greedy, conniving Laban, who basically sold his daughters for 14 years of free labor, and they are ready to leave as well. So Jacob then undertakes a clandestine operation. Leaving the city of Haran will not be as easy as arriving and coming there and being received into Laban's house. So Jacob is not just leaving, he's literally fleeing from Jacob's household, slipping away unnoticed, and he picks this opportune time when Laban is away with his workers for the sheep shearing. And there's this note added at the end of verse 19 that Rachel stole her father's household gods. And the word there translated household gods is the word teraphim, and scholars are not entirely agreed exactly what those are, but they were some sort of images or figures. They may have represented the family's ancestors. Whatever they were revered as gods of some kind. In other words, they were idols. And we might wonder what in the world Rachel was doing, and what did she hope to accomplish by stealing the household gods from her father's house? And we don't really know exactly. It may be that she simply thought they were going to bring good fortune. They were going to bring blessing. Maybe she thought that they would help her to have more children. Or it may be that they represent some kind of a right to a family inheritance that she thinks she can acquire by stealing the household gods. Whatever the purpose, there's a play in words that doesn't come out clearly in our translation in verse 20 when it says that Jacob tricked Laban. Literally it reads that he stole the heart of Laban the Aramean. So Rachel stole her father's gods. Jacob stole Laban's heart. And the significance of this, and this really the heart of this passage, is that at the end of the day it's Jacob who finally comes out on top. In this ongoing striving and struggle between Jacob and Laban, it's Jacob who gets the upper hand. Even though Laban tricked Jacob with Leah, even though Laban tried to trick Jacob out of his wages, it's Laban who's the heartless deceiver, the trickster, who finally ends up being deceived in the end. And I was reading a quotation about 2 men talking about a third man in their conversation, saying, he's the kind of guy that will follow you into a revolving door and still manage to come out ahead of you. And I think that's such a good description of Jacob's life. But why is it that way with Jacob? Why is it that Jacob is the one who comes out on top? Obviously it's because the Lord's covenant and the Lord's blessing are with him. The Lord has promised to be with him. He has been with him. The Lord is faithful to Jacob. Well, next the Lord protects Jacob from Laban. We see Jacob set out, and it's interesting how the text describes that he drove away all his livestock and all his property and that he gained, the livestock in his possession. Remember that Jacob came to Padan Aram with nothing but a walking stick, and he leaves with all this great wealth because the Lord has blessed him while he's been there. Laban didn't even find out that Jacob was gone until 3 days later, which is kind of ironic because you remember that Laban, in his zeal to protect his interest, had put 3 days' journey between himself and his flocks and Jacob and his flocks, and so now it took 3 days for him to find out that Jacob was gone. So that kind of came back to bite Laban as well. But when he found out, he didn't waste any time going out after Jacob. He took his kinsmen, the people of his household, and the clear implication is that Laban set out in force. This is, whatever else he has in mind, there's some kind of violence in Laban's mind and heart as he sets out after Jacob. He pursued him for 7 days, caught up to him in the hill country of Gilead, and then now God appears to Laban in a dream, basically warning him not to harm Jacob in any way, not to say anything to him, good or bad. All of that's followed by this somewhat dramatic confrontation that takes place between Jacob and Laban. This is the final showdown between the two of these men. So Laban, first of all, accuses Jacob by saying, "What have you done that you've tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword?" So, basically what Jacob did was he did not observe all the proper protocols and procedures of saying goodbye. And Laban basically argues that he would have thrown a big party and had a send-off for Jacob, which of course we suspect is probably not the case, that Laban would have actually sent Jacob away peaceably with all of the wealth that he had gained. Ultimately, this is about Jacob stealing Laban's gods. And he comes down to that point in verse 30, "But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob had a legitimate reason to be fearful and to leave in this clandestine kind of way. Fearful that Laban would forcibly try to keep his daughters and his grandchildren and would send Jacob away empty. And so as Jacob answers and says, "I was afraid, I thought you would take your daughters from me by force." And then notice he takes this rather hasty oath that was not a very wise thing to do when he said, "Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live." And unknowingly, he just pronounced the death sentence on his beloved wife. Of course, he had no idea that Rachel had stolen the gods. And now this is followed by a dramatic description of how Laban goes about searching for the stolen gods. And so the text kind of slows down here, and it tells us how he went first into Jacob's tent, then he went into Leah's tent, then he went into the tent with the 2 servant girls, and all the while we know they're really in Rachel's tent. And finally, lastly, he gets to Rachel's tent. But Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. And then she explains this, whether it was reality or not, that she could not stand up because she was in the way of women, as it were. And what we might read over and miss in this is the irony and for the Hebrew reader, that this is basically making a mockery of Laban's gods, because they've now been made unclean because they've touched a menstruating woman. And the picture is that these so-called gods had to be hidden in an unclean place and defiled to get away from the wrath of Laban. And so we're reminded again that it's because the Lord is looking out for Jacob. It has nothing to do with these false gods of Laban the Aramean. Well, once Laban has searched the tents and he can't find the gods that were stolen, Jacob basically unloads 20 years worth of frustration on his uncle Laban. And again, you get even more of a picture of how Jacob has been treated when he says, for instance, what was torn by wild beasts in verse 39, I did not bring to you, I bore the loss of it myself. Yet by ancient law, a shepherd was not normally held accountable for the cost of sheep that were killed by wild animals, and particularly if it was after night, was the normal procedure that the owner of the sheep bore the loss of that. But Jacob says, I even had to bear the loss of the animals that were killed. You changed my wages 10 times by day. The heat consumed me and the cold by night. By the way, one of the things that's interesting about this, remember that Jacob previously was the tent dweller. Jacob was the soft man. He said that in the day that he deceived his father when he said, Esau is a hairy man, but I'm a soft man. And after 20 years living with his uncle Laban, I would suggest Jacob is no longer the soft man. He's the man who's endured hardship, who has lived under the hot sun and endured the cold nights of the wilderness, and his character has been built and strengthened in that 20 years. And finally, Jacob's sort of tirade, his argument with his uncle Laban, comes to a climax at verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. And so again, you see that Jacob ascribes all of this to God's faithfulness. It was the God of Abraham and Isaac. It's because of his covenant faithfulness that Jacob was kept and saved from this deceitful, greedy uncle Laban. Jacob could perhaps identify with the later writing of the psalmist when he would say, he rescued me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me. For they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. Psalm 18. So the Lord protected Jacob from Laban, and then finally the Lord provides for peace with Laban. Laban's response is rather lame. There's very little he can say or do, but he's certainly not ready to admit himself being in the wrong either. He says, the daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine, but what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for their children, whom they have borne? And so Laban then proposes a covenant to which Jacob agrees, that they will have an agreement and a covenant of peace between them. Jacob set up a stone. He had those around him gather up stones and make a heap, and then he calls this place Galid, which means the place of a heap, or the same thing as the Aramaic Jigar Sahadutha, a heap. And this heap would be a perpetual witness. Laban also calls it Mitzpah, which had to do with a watch post or watchtower, because he says, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. And so the two were able to come to an agreement. And the heap of stones would be, on the one hand, a witness and a testimony to their agreement. On the other hand, it creates a border that Laban will stay on his side, and Jacob's supposed to stay on his side, that they would not seek to harm each other. One of the things that stands out about this agreement is that Laban says, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. And it's not quite as obvious again in our translation of this, but it appears that what Laban is doing is swearing by two different gods. The God of Abraham was one God, and the God of Nahor was another God in his mind. And in contrast, Isaac, or Jacob, we're told, swore by the fear of his father, Isaac. So while Laban swears by the gods of their respective fathers, Jacob would only swear by the fear of Isaac, or the true God. I just want to suggest that Jacob is a good model here. On the one hand, of how God's people should be peaceable. We ought to be the most easily reconciled, peaceable kind of people in the world. Always ready to make peace. To be, as Paul said, as much as it lies within you, be at peace with all men. But yet, while seeking to be at peace, to not sacrifice on the truth of, on the altar of peace, the truth of the gospel and the truth of the one true God for the sake of just getting along. Be peaceable and agreeable, but never compromise the truth of the gospel. The truth that Jesus Christ alone is the way, the truth, and the life, that there is one God, there is one mediator between man and God, and that is the man, Christ Jesus. Jacob then worshipped, and the next morning Laban arose and departed, and the two parted ways peaceably by God's grace. Well, again, Jacob arrived in Padan Aram with nothing but a stick and the clothes on his back. He left being a great company. Herds, flocks, servants, wives, children, and all of that was because of the blessing of God. Because the Lord was faithful to exactly what he promised Jacob. because the Lord was with Jacob, even while he was away in a foreign land. He blessed him, he gave him offspring, he made him prosper, he protected him from the schemes of his wicked uncle Laban, and now Jacob is ready and free to go on his journey. But here, Jacob's experience in this larger picture of his leaving, going away, and coming back mirrors the later experience of his descendants as the nation of Israel. Because the same way as the Lord had sent Jacob away from his home and into this foreign place, the Lord would send the Israelites from Canaan into the land of Egypt, into a place where they would be oppressed, where they would suffer injustice, where they would be made into slave labor and mistreated by Pharaoh. But just as the Lord blessed Jacob while he was in Haran, the Lord blessed and multiplied Israel while they were in bondage in Egypt. And even though it might seem like God was silent for several hundred years from the time that they went down to Egypt till the time that he sent Moses to bring them out of the land of Egypt, he never abandoned them in Egypt. He was with them, and eventually he brought them out of Egypt. He protected them from Pharaoh, even when Pharaoh pursued them out into the wilderness, and he brought them safely back to their homeland, to the promised land. But that itself is further a picture and a type of the redemption that we have in Jesus Christ. The ultimate redemption from bondage and sin under the curse of sin and death. In that sense, this text should remind us that the Lord is present with us, with his people, in all circumstances. The same way he protected Jacob through his years in Haran and brought him out safely, the same way he protected and he blessed Israel while they were in Egypt. He brought them out safely, brought them to the promised land. In the same way, the Lord will protect us, be with us, and keep us who believe in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ through all our years of sojourning, through all the hardships and the trials, through injustices that we might suffer, through whatever kinds of things that we are called to. The Lord is with us. The Lord will keep us. The Lord will bring us safely to our eternal home. See, the Lord's purpose is not to make us comfortable or to make us complacent in the world. The Lord calls us to persevere in faith through trials, hold fast to the promise of God, and to know that he's with us, that he's for us in Jesus Christ. His purpose is to sanctify us, to grow us in faith, so that all the trials and the difficulties that we face in life are things that are made to work to his eternal purpose, for his glory, for our good. We would grow in our faith in the Lord, that we would learn more to trust in him and see his grace and his favor in our lives. That ultimately he will bring us to our eternal inheritance, in which we would be able to look back on all of life and see that God was there. The Lord has been with us, blessed us, kept us, and preserved us through thick and thin. And he will bring us safely to our heavenly home. Well, let us pray.